Record.
Thanks for being here, Adrien.
So happy. I'm so happy to be doing it.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks. So I'm going to get started here. My name is David Holliday. I'm the Vice President of National Student Exchange. I'm also the National Student Exchange Coordinator at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. So I'd like to welcome everybody, including Adrien, to today's webinar. I do want to start today by saying the name George Floyd. He was the Black man killed by Minneapolis police about 12 days ago. This is in my neighborhood, in my part of the city. My heart aches for the family of George Floyd, for specifically the Black community of the Twin Cities and across the United States, and many others impacted by racial justice in this country. So I wanted to begin by saying that. I also wanted to share that this topic specifically, we had kind of set this on the agenda probably a month ago, but I also feel like this is so relevant, such an important topic, especially when you think about intersectionality in terms of justice movements. And so the connections between Black Lives Matter and trans lives and GLBT folks in general is so critical. So again, I want to welcome you all here today. Use the chat bar if you have questions or comments that you want addressed either by Leah, Deborah, myself, or Adrien, or Greg, and we'll get to them as we can. I'm going to introduce Greg Golden, who is the NSE Coordinator from the University of New Mexico. Do you want to say a few words, Greg?
Again, Greg here. I'm not going to do any talking today. The subject matter expert. I just happen to be fortunate enough to be geographically close to Adrien Lawyer here. Adrien has done a couple of trainings on this very topic for my staff in the Dean of Students Office at the University of New Mexico. And he's moved our trajectory in a really positive way in helping out trans folks on campus, community members, yeah, Adrien is fantastic. So thanks for being here, my friend, and thanks for repping New Mexico. Do us well. So yeah, I'll let Adrien introduce himself. So
no pressure though. No pressure. Yeah. Okay, good. This is representing the whole entire state, so that's awesome. And no, I'm proud to do it. I'm so proud to do it, and I'm so happy to be here. And I echo the sentiments, that have already been expressed. I think I'm from the South. I'm from the southeastern United States, and so to me, I think it's also important to acknowledge that nothing that's happening is new at all. This is all stuff that's been going on for hundreds of years in our country, and I think it's important that we're seeing people get to a point where the response is commensurate to the violence that we've been experiencing and witnessing for a long time. We're going to talk about how racial discrimination and violence really overlaps with trans discrimination and violence as part of what we talk about anyway in our training. So hopefully that'll feel resonant to what everybody's feeling and experiencing and going through right now. All right, let me get my slides up for y'all. I also really love it when this is more of a dialogue, and I know that can be really hard to do with Zoom, and I know that some folks are much more comfortable typing into the chat. I heard that the organizers are going to be watching the chat, but I also tend to do that myself too. So if you have a comment or a question, I don't know, David, are folks able to unmute themselves or do they have to be unmuted?
We have this setup where they have to be unmuted.
Okay.
And I can actually see if we can do that. Yeah, I have to do it one by one.
Okay,
so
no problem.
So I guess I would say, folks, as you're listening, if you do want to voice a comment, just alert me in the chat bar and I can unmute you. I think I have to do it one by one.
Okay, great.
So yeah, the format here is a little bit difficult for conversation.
Yeah, I know, and I do most of mine as Zoom meetings, and this may be a Zoom webinar. I know that's a little bit different, but we'll try our best to keep an eye out for you, and I really do want to hear anything that you have to say. So if you want to type it into the chat, just know that I have that up on my screen. I can watch it. If you want to say something, I can't see everybody who's here, so just make sure that you identify yourself in some way. Maybe you have the raise hand feature even. I don't know, but I think our organizers will be watching for you as well. So if you have something to ask or say, I hope you'll do your best to let us know, because we definitely want to hear from you. Okay, so my name's Adrien Lawyer. Isn't that funny? My name is Lawyer. It's spelled exactly like a lawyer, but I am not an attorney. People sometimes mistakenly think that I am because that's my name. What I am is the co-director of an organization called the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we could spend a lot of time talking about the pros and cons of that. There are definitely some real downsides to that designation. But for us, it felt important when we were forming our organization to try to achieve that status with the IRS, to be able to be in specific funding streams that we're not able to access without that. So for us at this time, it still feels like the right thing, although there are some real serious limitations to it, and also some philosophical downsides to it as well. But we're a 501c3. We're a statewide organization here in New Mexico. We do all of our work under three main headers. So we do direct service work. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Does anybody else hear it? Am I the only one? Okay, I'll just work through it.
I don't hear it. Yeah, I don't hear it on my end.
Okay, let me
I
just.
think it's you, David. I think it was your microphone was picking up.
Mine, Greg?
Yeah, yours.
Maybe.
Sounds good. I'll mute myself. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, thanks, Anya and Tara. Okay, so we do direct service work, which is very typical for nonprofit organizations. We just try to plug in with individual trans people and help them in any way we can. There are things that we can do for folks no matter where they are in the state, and actually in the region. We have definitely been able to help people in Colorado and Arizona. There's not necessarily a transgender resource center that does the same sort of scope of what we do in those states or the states around us. There are some amazing transgender activists doing amazing work in Colorado and in Arizona, but not maybe a lot of organizations that are able to provide some of the direct service relief that we do to people, which includes helping folks change their names, helping them update their identity documents, information, referrals, peer support, peer counseling, what is called trans-specific items. So like I send out a lot of binders to young trans guys who don't have access to those things, don't have financial access to them, wigs, bras, things that people may need but have a hard time getting for themselves. So we're able to help people wherever they are with things like that. Here in Albuquerque, we have our only physical location, which houses our drop-in center. At the drop-in center, we tend to be providing services to the trans people in our communities who are the most marginalized. And again, we're going to talk about that, and it is absolutely something that we have to look at from an intersectional perspective. So that's a big part of what we're going to discuss. We do advocacy work as well, which can be very one-on-one, just serving as advocates for individual trans folks who are in settings where they're really inhibited or intimidated. Like name change hearings have to be done in front of a district court judge. So there are some folks who feel really comfortable interacting with systems that way, and other people who just have really for a long time put off getting their name legally changed because they were too intimidated to have that hearing at the courthouse in front of the judge. So people have asked us to just go and be advocates for them in those scenarios, and we absolutely do that. But we also do the advocacy work of writing and reviewing trans policy throughout the state, and also legislative advocacy. So we help to pass laws that help trans people. And I would say for me, our most high impact victory in the last couple of years was a law called the Vital Records Modernization Act here in New Mexico. Before our law, it had been the legal requirement that people seeking to change the gender on their birth certificate here had to undergo surgery and have a letter that proved they had had surgery on their body. And our Vital Records Department had actually clarified that they really meant surgery on the genitals in order to change that gender designation. And from today's point of view, that's just not best practices. It doesn't make sense. It's not the way that we should get identity documents that match who we are, is by surgically altering our genitals. There are a lot of folks who don't want to have that surgery. So we eliminated the surgical requirement. Now changing the gender on your birth certificate is just a very simple form that it just has to be notarized. So it doesn't need to be co-signed by a provider or anybody else. It just has to be notarized, which is typically a free service that you can access lots of places. We even have some of our staff who are notary publics now So it made it a much more streamlined thing to get that changed. That also allowed us to change it with the MVD here. And not only did we eliminate the surgical requirement, we added a third marker, which is increasingly becoming best practices around the country. As we're going to talk about, there are trans folks who don't think of themselves as simply a man or simply a woman. These are people that we typically refer to under the umbrella term of non-binary. And those folks often don't want a gender marker that reads male or female on their documents. And around the country, what's becoming the kind of shared practice is to have an X as the alternate marker, some F or X. And now in New Mexico, you can have any of those three markers on your birth certificate or your driver's license with just a notarized form. The last thing that we do is education. So in 10 years, I have probably delivered some version of this training, coming up on like 1,400 times, for law enforcement, medical professionals, behavioral health, educators, corrections folks, first responders, public safety, businesses, faith communities, really you name it. So if anybody would like to help me train another group, then just contact me afterwards and we'd love to facilitate that. So this is Sylvia Rivera. She is one of the heroes of the modern trans civil rights movement in the United States. She lived in New York City until her death in 2003. She's a transgender woman of Puerto Rican descent. She was a pretty fierce and radical activist. So there are definitely folks who maybe felt turned off by her voice and her perspective, but she was also a person who was really intent on speaking the truth as she saw it, no matter how much people resisted or even possibly didn't agree. So she's somebody who often didn't have secure housing. She is someone who engaged in what we refer to as survival economies, including the commercial sex trade, just to try to get by, just to try to survive. But even so, she spent her life trying to improve safety and access for other people. So these are the folks that back in Sylvia's day and even right now are the backbone of our movement. They're at the forefront of our movement, taking a lot of personal risk to do the work of trying to make the world a better place for other LGBTQ and trans people. All right, so let's start with some definitions. For us, the word transgender is actually a really simple term. And again, it's an umbrella term, right? So it's meant to be a really broad term that encompasses a lot of different people. So for us, the word transgender is most easily and most effectively defined as a person whose gender, and gender just means that internal knowing about who you are. That's what we mean by the term gender. It's someone's own internal awareness, usually very deeply felt. It's a very core part of how we think of ourselves in terms of gender. So whether you deeply and truly know yourself to be a man or a woman or something else is what we refer to as your gender. So if your gender does not match or is different from the sex you were designated at birth, then for us, that falls under the umbrella term of transgender. So your designated sex at birth, of course, is whatever they said about you on the day that you were born. So when a baby is born, we categorize the baby typically as male or female. And for trans folks, whatever that designation was doesn't match what we know to be true about ourselves. So you'll notice that it doesn't say that the gender is the opposite of the designated sex, right? Because I've already started talking about non-binary people because I was talking about our bill that we passed in 2019. So non-binary people exist. They are absolutely part of the movement and they're part of our sort of population of concern. So when we are writing policy, when we are creating law, we are definitely thinking about non-binary people as much as we are thinking about trans people who fit into the gender binary. Now, of course, some of us do, right? For me, I'm a pretty binary person. I'm not proud of it. I'm not trying to advance the gender binary, but my designated sex at birth was female. My gender is male. And I have known that about myself since I was about 2 or 3 years old. It's one of the earliest things that I knew to be true about myself as a human being. So for me, I mean, I guess those things fit into what we call the gender binary. And that's true about me as an individual trans person. But there are so many people in my community and even in my friends and family group that are non-binary that we would never define trans as something like a gender which is opposite from the designated sex. That's why we just say different from or not the same as. We want to make sure and include all the folks who maybe don't fit into the gender binary. Now, there are definitely non-binary people who don't use the word transgender to talk about themselves or maybe don't identify with that word. We are not trying to say that everybody will use this as their name tag or their label. That's okay. We're not trying to force this label on anybody. We're just trying to make sure that for us at TGRC, that we're thinking of everybody under this umbrella when we do our work. And for me, I think this is a single word that can help to convey the concept of gender being different from designated sex, regardless of the individual labels that people use to speak about themselves. You'll also notice that our definition doesn't include anything medical, right? We still actually have transgender people who actually try to criticize other transgender people for not having transition-related medical treatments done. And for us, that's really abhorrent. Being a person who undergoes medical treatment does not make you more trans or less trans than other people. It doesn't make you more male or more female than someone else. So we really just want to be clear that whether somebody doesn't want medical treatment or they are not able to access medical treatment for different reasons, that is definitely not part of how we define this. In fact, I have known transgender folks who lived their entire lives in the closet, and of course they were still transgender, right? So whether you come out, whether you tell anybody that you're trans is not what makes you trans. Undergoing medical treatment is not what makes you trans. Some of us deeply need those treatments and benefit from them. Again, that's my story for sure, right? I just told you that I was designated female at birth, so you can clearly see that I undergo medical treatment. As I love to say, you do not grow an awesome beard like this without taking hormones. I have been on testosterone therapy for about 15 years. I had surgery on my chest about 16 years ago. So for me, those things were really crucial. I had a very painful, difficult relationship to my body before I was able to get those treatments. So for me, it helped me to be a person who takes a lot better care of myself. I engage with my medical team in a completely different way. I think I'm a better parent because of it. I am a person who's invested in living a long life in a completely different way than I was before. So for some of us, medical treatment is a really critical step in our journey. For other people, they just may not feel that same pull towards it. And then other folks maybe don't have insurance. I think about the people who live in rural parts of our state. They may not be able to access a provider who knows how to do these things, even if they have insurance. So we definitely don't limit this to people who have medical treatment. And this is just to make sure that people know the difference between a transgender man and a transgender woman. As we've already said, there are lots of different kinds of people beyond men and women. So we're not trying to say this encompasses everybody. I also just want to say briefly that some trans folks don't really like the word trans and they don't identify with it. There's a whole lot of really interesting dialogue happening right now around whether the trans liberation movement should actually be more closely aligned with disability justice. And there are lots of trans people who actually relate to being trans as a type of a disability or a medical condition, which I find deeply fascinating. I'll be 50 this summer. So I was born in 1970. I came out for the first time in the early to mid 80s. So for me, just because of my own history, I grew up pretty steeped in sort of identity politics, and there's a lot of downside to identity politics, but I also just can't help it. That's sort of in the LGBTQ communities that I was raised up in, I learned to think of these things as powerful and as culturally distinct, right? So I identify as a trans person and I'm proud of being trans. I feel like that there aren't a lot of other men my age who have the experiences that I've had and have the perspective that I have. So for me, being transgender is an identity. But for a lot of folks in our trans communities, they don't feel that way about it. So they wouldn't want to be referred to as a transgender man or a transgender woman. They would just want to be referred to as a man or a woman. So I don't introduce these terms to say that they're universally applicable. I only introduce these terms to make 100% sure that everyone on the call knows which one is a transgender man and which one is a transgender woman before we leave here today. Because not knowing the difference results in some pretty negative outcomes and results in a lot of what feels like disrespectful interaction for trans folks. So I am a transgender man. I am a man and I am transgender. So I'm a transgender man. And I know when I say it that way, it sort of sounds like duh. You know, it makes me laugh every time I say it, but it's important just to be distinct about this, right? So Sylvia Rivera on the previous slide is a transgender woman. Now in her lifetime, it's interesting that she used a lot of different terminology to talk about herself because this stuff is constantly evolving. But today, from today's point of view, we look at Sylvia and we think of her as a transgender woman. So when we use these words, what we want to make sure is that we are always centering the person's current and true gender, right? I don't usually hear transgender men referred to as women or female, but I still frequently hear transgender women referred to as men or males, or he or sir. And for us, that is, again, it's deeply disrespectful, right? If someone's gender is female, then they should be referred to with female terminology, female words, and we want to make sure that we're addressing somebody by their gender. Now, I think what happens here is actually that we have what I believe is sort of a natural curiosity about people's genitalia. Even within the trans communities, I've had people kind of, privately tell me that when they meet another trans person, one of the first questions that pops into their mind is whether the person has had surgery on their genitals. So even within the trans world, there's sort of a reflexive curiosity about people's genitals and whether they've had surgery on their genitals. So I think if that happens for you, if you have an instant sort of wondering or curiosity about that, I think for me, the main thing I would want to give to you is that you should not feel ashamed about that at all. And just know that even trans folks sometimes feel that way and wonder about other people's bodies. So it's not shameful to wonder about that. And it's not really harmful to have that question pop into your mind. The harmful thing is what can come next after that, right? So if you find yourself meeting a trans person and wondering like, wow, I wonder if they've had surgery down there. I wonder what their genitals look like. I wonder what kind of genitals they have. That's totally cool. But the next thing you need to do is let it go, right? Because we don't talk about genitals in our culture. You are very unlikely to see that person's genitals. Their genitals are really probably not going to be any of your concern in whatever interaction you have with them. So let the thought arise, but then just let it pass. It doesn't really matter. And it's not something that you want to color your interaction with that person. We do not live in a genital displaying culture. So we are not using genitals to validate people as men and women. We think we do. That's where the old birth certificate law came from in New Mexico, was this widespread misconception that your genitals are what make you a man or a woman. But really, we don't know anyone's genitals that we interact with every day. So obviously, that's not the criterion that we use, right? So I have a male driver's license. I have a male passport, a male social security record. I show those things, at different intervals throughout my life. I show my driver's license to people pretty frequently, but I show my body underneath my clothes never, right? So I don't show that to get into a bar or to board a plane or any of those things. So obviously that's not what we're using. So let's just not get bogged down or preoccupied with somebody's genitals. Let's make sure we talk about them based in their gender. I see a question in the chat that asks, is there a movement in the trans community to widen the meanings of man and woman so that they are umbrella terms as well? And for me, I think that's useful. And I think on some level we already do this, right? Like I have friends who are cisgender men. They are not transgender. And they perform as drag queens. But in my experience, nobody questions the fact that they identify as male or would refer to themselves as men. right? So we already accept kind of a wide variety of expression and behavior for men and women, but I still think we could do a lot better job. And there are definitely people who I think adhere to some really rigid stereotypes around masculinity and femininity in our culture, and we'd love to see that ease up, because I think those are very harmful to a wide array of people, right? So let's talk for just a second about the last thing on this slide that's important, which is that the word transgender is an adjective. It has to describe a type of person. You can say that someone is a transgender educator. Like for me, I'm a transgender dad, I'm a transgender man, I'm a transgender person, but I am not a transgender. And we still hear that. And maybe there's not anybody in this room who would ever do that, but I still too frequently hear somebody use the word transgender as a noun to talk about somebody else. So we don't do that because it's essentially dehumanizing, right? I am a complex person. I have a whole lot of attributes and identities and identifiers that make me into who I am. Transgender is absolutely one of them, but it's just one of them. So we're going to talk about my intersectional identities. We're going to talk about how this plays out in the trans communities. So I'm going to just quickly show this video to define intersectionality, if there's anyone in here who's not familiar with that term.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
Okay, so let's talk about some attributes that I have. Let's sort of lay this out and think about how this works. So I am a white person. I'm a man. I am transgender. I was born a U.S. citizen. So from the very first day of my life, I was a documented citizen. I'm a dad. I'm a musician. I actually play in a little band, a country band here in Albuquerque. We're called A Band Named Sue. Isn't that funny? I have a bachelor's degree. I am a person with disabilities. I'm a Southerner, as I said earlier. English is the only language that I'm really fluent in terms of like speaking and reading and writing. I'm from a mixed class background. So when I say that, I mean socioeconomic class. Oh, and it's kind of hard to think about this today. We've seen a lot from a lot of unwanted talk from Drew Brees this week, but I am from the South and I love the Saints and I like sports. I like football and I also really like soccer. So those are some things about me. Some are lighter, some are heavier, right? But these are some attributes that make me into who I am. There's 12 things on the screen right now, and only one of them is being trans. I am prominently trans. I teach these classes for 10 years now in every different part of the country and all over my own home state. I'm out as a trans person. I run a trans organization that I'm also a founder of. So clearly that's a prominent identifier that I have, but it's just one among many at the same time, right? So that's why we don't want to call somebody a transgender. We're all so much more than that. But when we look at this from that intersectional lens, through that intersectional lens, then we also have to look at this list about me and think about how does it create the treatment that I receive in the dominant culture in which I live, right? There are a lot of cultural groups within the United States, but when I say the dominant culture, I know that you all know what I mean. It's what we're surrounded by every day. It's definitely a white dominated culture in our country. I think about like media, movies, magazines, you know, the things that we're surrounded by, the things that we see, often the things that are put forth as the norm, right? So within that culture, this list is not a portrait of discrimination or violence. It's actually a portrait of unearned privilege. And I know that that's true because I had my list change in my own adult life, right? Like this isn't the way I have always been perceived. Before I came out and began my transition in the mid 2000s, early to mid 2000s, I had already lived for 20 years of my life as what we used to call a butch lesbian. So I was a really masculine looking lesbian woman. And there are all different kinds of lesbians. There are very feminine looking lesbians. Again, I'm sure everybody in this room already knows that, but I always feel like I need to say it, right? You can't look like a lesbian. But for me, I was a person who wore all men's clothes and I had really short hair, but my body looked really different from this. So what would actually happen a lot of times when I was out in public spaces is that people couldn't tell if I was a man or a woman. They would feel uncomfortable and then they would change the way they treated me, right? Sometimes I got treated with hostility. Sometimes back in those days, I really did encounter actual violence. I have a memory of walking down the street with a girlfriend in the South and having somebody throw something out of a moving car window at us. So I did have those kinds of encounters back then. But one of the more consistent things that happened to me, and it was very regular, was that people would try to disrupt me anytime I would try to use a public restroom. So I thought that I was obligated to use the women's bathroom, but other people in public spaces did not think that I should be in the women's bathroom. So either a woman who was already in the bathroom would get upset and start to kind of freak out when I would go in the bathroom, or I also had the pretty regular experience of someone outside the bathroom starting to sort of shout at me when I would be trying to go into the bathroom, like, hey, you can't go in there, that's the wrong bathroom, when I was just trying to go to the bathroom as an adult person, right? Well, now you can see this from my list, but you can also see it by looking at me. Like no one ever tells me where to go to the bathroom anymore. I never get questioned trying to use a public restroom. And what I find is in these last 15 years, people are more reluctant to confront me or question me about anything that I'm doing, any behavior that I'm engaged in. I can feel that people are nervous that I might get angry or upset if they ask me a question. Customer service people are much more deferential and again seem anxious that I might call for a manager or get aggravated. People treat everything that I say with more respect and authority than they did before. People frequently assume that I'm the leader of any group that I'm in, even if I am 100% not the leader of the group. And those things didn't happen to me prior to my transition, but I am the same person that I was prior to my transition. So we can't say that it has anything to do with me as a person. It's obviously based in some of the things on this list and some of the things that aren't on this list. but identities that I carry that cause me to be the recipient of unearned privilege in our dominant culture. Again, this is borne up by the fact that I didn't always present in the same way, and I didn't always get treated in the same way. So the treatment changed along with the change in my presentation and other people's perceptions of me. So where am I vulnerable to discrimination in this list? I feel like these are the places where I could have bad experiences. And I have. I've experienced real access problems by virtue of my disabilities, and I've experienced employment discrimination as a trans person. I was actually fired from the corporate job that I was in 15 years ago when I started my transition because I started my transition. I know sometimes people must think like, how do you know that that was the reason? But we actually had to take my termination to the Department of Labor in our state for arbitration, and the company that I was working for actually ended up having to settle with me about it. So I felt pretty validated around the fact that my assessment of the situation was very likely correct. So I lost my job as a trans person when my kiddo was just a really little baby. He was less than a year old, and my salary from that company was our family's only income. So that was a really scary thing, and I did experience that, and that really was discrimination as a transgender person. But I don't experience the worst outcomes that trans people experience, and one thing that will never happen to me is that I will never be violently attacked out on the street for being trans, because both my trans status and my disabilities are very hard to see. I find that most people don't know that I'm transgender unless I share the information that I'm transgender with them. So unless I tell people that I'm trans, they really don't know that about me to target me for violence or discrimination. And my disabilities are pretty hard to spot as well. Usually I have to tell the whole story about how I became a person with disabilities for people to kind of see that about me or understand it about me. So let's talk about who does experience the worst outcomes in our culture. And what we find is that when people have more marginalized identifiers or identities and they are trans, they experience the worst discrimination and violence. So one of the ways that we can look at this in our communities is that the folks who come to the drop-in center for services are almost all young trans women. They are almost all folks of color. They almost all have some kind of medical or behavioral health disability. The vast majority of them are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing, and the vast majority are unemployed and again engaged in survival economies. Most of them don't have families who love them and care for them. So they go to our drop-in center every day to get the only meal they're going to eat for the day, to use the only safe bathroom they have access to check their mail because our drop-in center serves as their mailing address, to access things like free monthly bus passes, HIV testing, case management, all of the different services that we have at our center. And everyone who goes to the center is trans, and I'm trans. But I don't ever have to leave my house to get something to eat. I have a home, I have a car, I have a spouse, I have groceries every single day. I don't want to oversimplify this, right? You already heard that I got fired for transitioning. So transgender men, including white transgender men, can experience discrimination for being trans. It's not all or nothing. But when we look at this, it is very clear, and it's clear from the data as well, that trans women, especially trans women of color, experience the worst outcomes within the trans communities. Transgender men have actually been shown to die by suicide at the highest rate among trans people, but transgender women are statistically vastly more likely to be physically attacked by a stranger on the street, up to and including being murdered. So what we're talking about here is societal discrimination and violence, and how it disproportionately impacts trans folks based on these intersectional identities that we carry. Now, being visibly trans opens you up to physical violence as well, even if you have other privileged identities. So I have a friend who also has a home and a car and a spouse and food. She is an older, white, affluent, educated trans woman, but she is visibly trans. So she has actually been sent to the hospital twice by virtue of being attacked by strangers on the street. So it's important to just know that this is a complex picture that we're trying to paint here. She absolutely does have many advantages over the trans women at the drop-in center. And she also knows that every time she leaves her home, she could be violently harmed, right? So we just want to be clear that this is not a simple thing, it's a complex thing. And at the same time, we know that trans women of color are experiencing the worst of the discrimination and violence. So let's talk about being visibly trans so we understand that. Everyone on the screen is trans. And we find that everyone on this screen pretty much blends in, 100% of the time, just like I do. So wherever I travel, wherever I go, people do not suspect that I am trans. They do not think that I am trans. The thought doesn't cross their mind, like, is that a transgender person? They're just not even considering that when they meet me. And that is also true for pretty much everybody on the screen. So that's important because I think there are folks who mistakenly believe that they always would be able to pick out a transgender person just on sight. I have trained folks who said that to me before, and they didn't mean anything negative by it at all, right? They just held the mistaken belief that all trans people are visibly trans, but lots of trans people just blend in. So why is it that some folks don't? I will say that it's predominantly trans women who are visibly trans, and that I think what feeds into that is the age at which you begin your transition, and also just genetic factors that are beyond people's control. There are some transgender men who maybe can be spotted if they don't choose to undergo medical treatment or if they're early on in the process of medical treatment. Because we know that not everybody wants medical treatment. So there are folks who don't physically or medically transition, and then they may be able to be spotted, right? But for those of us who do medical treatment, if you take testosterone, you are going to blend in. Testosterone is a powerful, potent substance, and it changes so much about your body. It is so thorough that we tend to assimilate visually, right? It changed my voice. It stopped my period. It changed my musculature. It changed the fat distribution patterns on my body, the texture of my skin, all of my body odors, the shape of some of the bones in my face, my hairline, right? I grew a lot of really strange and unfortunate hair all over my body in a lot of really weird places. That's all from testosterone, right? So testosterone really shifts the way that you look and even smell, so that other people are not going to pick you out. But if a transgender woman has already undergone a testosterone-based puberty, then the changes that testosterone makes to you, some of them can't be reversed through medical treatment. So one big example is the voice. If your voice has lowered from testosterone, it can't be put back the way that it was before. There just is no way to do that. So actually, I have friends who glean a lot of confidence by taking these classes that are offered to teach folks how to modulate their voice, to speak in a way that is more stereotypically feminine. So I have some trans female friends who took those classes and just loved them, and they make them feel a lot more confident because they know how to control their voice and speak in a way that people tend to read as female or as feminine. But I have other friends who just don't want to go to all that trouble every time they have something to say. They just want to be themselves and what they feel is just authentically themselves. But her low voice is going to cause people to take notice of her in public spaces, and maybe the thing that sort of gives her away as a trans person. Another big factor is skeletal frame. There is no surgery or hormonal treatment that can alter your height, the width of your shoulders, the size of your hands. So those are things that can be factors that help people to identify a trans person in public. Hair growth and hair loss can be other big factors, right? If someone is already older before they start their transition, they've already experienced baldness on top of the head, you can't regrow your hair. So some people feel most confident wearing a wig, but it may be that her wig is the thing that people notice about her and realize that she's transgender, because the first thing they realize is that she's wearing a wig. So The people on the screen, the women on the screen all transitioned at a young age, which is very helpful. And they are also what some of my friends would call like genetically lucky. They are probably shorter. They are more petite. They have finer features, right? Smaller noses, potentially like higher, more prominent cheekbones. So there are definitely things that are just genetic factors for these women that cause them not to have as much of an uphill climb in terms of blending in visually or assimilating visually. So there are definitely trans folks, men and women, who blend in, and there are other people that are not able to blend in or who don't want to blend in. But those are the people who are right in the line of a lot of physical violence in our culture today. So it's just really important to think about that and think about, again, that this is a big factor in terms of the outcomes that people face. So cisgender, what does this mean? Cisgender, does anybody want to tell me in the chat? I know you've heard this word before, and I already said it too, so it's sort of a pop quiz. Who will type the definition of cisgender into the chat? Are you nervous? Do you know this word? Maybe you're not familiar with it. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Daniela and Tara, thank you. Wonderful. That's exactly right. All three of y'all got this exactly right. The word cisgender just means someone whose gender matches their designated sex, right? That's it. The simplest way that we would define cisgender is not transgender. So for a transgender person, the gender and the sex don't match. For a cisgender person, they do, right? Now, why do we need this term? It's interesting that there's a lot of resistance to this word. Often the thing that I'll hear is like, this is just so much about being PC. Why do we have to be so PC? But for us, this is not about being politically correct or being PC, right? This is about making sure that we have value neutral language to describe somebody who is part of the dominant majority group. If we don't have these words, then what we default to are words like normal. And for trans folks, that's pretty offensive, right? That means that being trans is abnormal in some way. And what we know is that being transgender is actually a normal human variation. That what we think we're looking at here is a minority trait among humans, being trans. I actually believe that transgender folks are going to turn out to be as much as 3% of the population. Right now, if you Google estimates on the transgender population size, anything that you're able to turn up is going to be kind of dangerously low, in my opinion. I'm going to show you some New Mexico data near the end that I think helps to sort of shore up my theory that we're going to turn out to be a bigger group than people thought. Right now, there's no major demographic tool that counts trans folks. We look a lot of times to tools like the census to get a baseline estimate about like how many, like how many Vietnamese folks live in the United States. We look to things like the census to get those kind of estimates. And right now, you can't identify yourself as trans on the census. So we don't have a great way to get a baseline on this. And I think all of the academic guesses out there are low. And I understand why they would try to be conservative, but I also think it's dangerous to underestimate a population that's already being so marginalized right now at this moment in history. So I think it's going to turn out to be larger. Now, the thing about minority traits is that human beings don't tend to treat groups with minority traits very well. And we can look around our culture right now and see a lot of different groups that have minority traits being treated with hostility and violence in our dominant culture. It is not hard to find a plethora of groups that are being mistreated for having minority traits. So when I talk about this, what I looked for are minority trait groups that have been persecuted in the past, but who now have been integrated, because it always gives me hope to see that as human beings, we're capable of it, right? So the two examples that I usually talk about are folks who are born with red hair. And people born with red hair are actually less than 2% of the population. So it is my firmly held belief that there are more trans people right now than people born with red hair. But people born with red hair have now come to be integrated in our dominant culture and is not something that we persecute or treat with violence or hostility anymore, but we totally used to. And when we look back hundreds of years to the way that people with red hair were treated, they were said to be possessed by the devil. People said that folks with red hair didn't have a human soul, and therefore they would try to steal your soul, so they were dangerous to those of us who weren't redheaded. There was, people, you think about like the witch trials in European history especially, people who had red hair were frequently accused of being witches. The red hair was used as the reason that they were suspected of being witches. And then once you were accused of being a witch, you were most likely going to die just from the accusation, because the practice was to often test people to find out whether they were truly a witch or not. And the test was actually to drown you in water, because the thought was, if you were a witch, your sort of evil magic powers were going to come forward and you would save yourself from drowning via your witch powers, right? So if you died from the drowning, you had proven that you were innocent of being a witch. And if you survived the drowning, then you had proven that you were in fact a witch. So you were burned at the stake most of the time, but also sometimes they employed things like crushing someone to death under heavy stones, right? So this is stuff that would happen to people, women especially, right? Just because they were born with red hair. It made you super unsafe. And now, of course, we don't do anything like that. The statistic that I've read is that 30% of women who color their hair choose a shade of red just because they aesthetically prefer it. And obviously they do not think that we are going to stone them or drown them or burn them to death when they come out of the salon with red hair. We just don't do anything like that anymore. Now, a much more recent example with a much larger group is folks who are left-handed. They are 10% of the population. And even within the last 50 years, within my own lifetime, there are folks who unironically said that left-handed people were possessed by the devil. Now, do y'all hear a little pattern in this? Because we definitely do, right? Both of those groups in their time were said to be possessed by the devil. The word sinister comes from the Latin word for left, which is sinistra. There were teachers, even within the last 35 years, so all of this within my own lifetime, there were teachers in schools who would tie little left-hand kids' hands behind their back inside the classroom to force them to learn to write and do other things with their right hand. Now, can y'all imagine if an educator did that today, what would happen? I mean, it would just be total chaos. The parents would storm the school in protest, right? Anya says that still happens in much of the world, and I think that's absolutely true. I would say in the U.S., though, right, my presentation kind of tends to center on U.S. culture. And look, we have a lefty in the room who had a teacher who wanted to recondition this person as a child, and the parents actually intervened. Now, I've had folks in my training say that actually they didn't try reprogramming them to be right-handed at school, but it was their parents who beat them at home until they learned to use the right hand. So, and this was in the UK, not the US, and the person was in the 5th grade when this happened. So right in our midst in this webinar today, we have someone who had that experience, right? But we typically don't see that same thing happen to kindergartners or children today in the United States, right? And in fact, in the US, we now manufacture tools for left-handed people like scissors and can openers and rifles and guitars so that lefties can live in a world that was designed for right-handed people. And in y'all's lifetimes, you will never sit through an hour-and-a-half PowerPoint training about why you should accept left-handed people, why you should not disrespect left-handed people, why God does not hate left-handed people, why left-handed people are not possessed by the devil, because you really don't need a PowerPoint presentation to teach you about why we should accept left-handed people. You already know that, right? So part of that, one ingredient in that is value neutral language. We don't come in here today and say, oh, you're left-handed, that's so interesting, but I'm normal, I just want you to know that, right? We say you're left-handed, but I'm right-handed, because it's just two things that you can be. They're both normal, they're both neutral. They don't have value over one another, right? So that's why transgender and cisgender are important, because they're just neutral terms to describe the dominant group, like right-handed, cisgender, and the minority group, which is left-handed or transgender. But I believe that in 50 years, we will think about this in a totally different way. I don't believe that in 50 years, we'll still be having to do trainings like this. And I think the word cisgender is part of what's going to get us there. Now, see, look, in the 90s and early 2000s, one of our friends in the room was a lefty and still was forced to have to adapt to right-handed equipment. So, I mean, you know, this being a person with a minority trait affects a lot of different areas of your life more than you would even know. But what we're looking for, I think, is to get to the place where trans folks don't face outright violence for this, and the way that lefties have. But hopefully, I hope, Anya and Brigitte, you would tell me that you've never, you know, you haven't faced violence for being a left-handed person. And with trans folks, we definitely want to come out of the era where people actually attack trans people or murder them for being transgender. Let's go lefties. I love all of that. And you have redheaded sisters. Isn't that funny? My co-director, my brother from another mother at TGRC is transgender, and he's redheaded. He always says, though, at least he's right-handed, right? He has that going for him, I guess. So designated sex, when we classify newborn babies, what we use is genitals, right? We really just look at the baby's genitalia, their external genitals, and we classify them typically as male or female. Now, what we want to do is not conflate our genital-based categorization with biological sex, right? I've had people say that to me. Well, we sort newborn babies based on their biological sex, but we don't. We actually just use their genitals to do this sorting process. Biological sex includes your gonads, right? What is your internal reproductive organs? It includes your hormones. It includes your chromosomes. And I was so lucky to be in the room when my kiddo was born. The best day of my life was the day that he was born. And not one person in that room tested his chromosomes before they declared him to be a boy, right? So they looked at his genitals. They said the baby's a boy, and that was the end of it. And I am totally okay with that. That is how we have sorted babies for a really long time, but that is not his biological sex. It is just his genitals, okay? So when we talk about biological sex, we can see that human beings are actually much more varied and diverse than two categories can hold. One of the things that I say a lot is that there are not just two kinds of people in this world. So when we talk about male and female being the only categories, it really doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up even biologically, because intersex people exist. Now, intersex folks used to be called hermaphrodites. That word has actually come to be a slur at this point. So the word hermaphrodite is really negative. They've asked us to stop using it. We're definitely trying to shy away from hermaphrodite and use the word intersex instead. And intersex just simply means that you have a biological trait that does not fit neatly into our typical definitions for male and female, right? So this can be something like being born with ambiguous genitalia, so genitals that are in between the two typical types. But it can also mean things like having chromosomal variations that are not even obvious visibly, right? You can't see certain chromosomal variations. You can't tell that someone has atypical chromosomes just by looking at them. So again, we think of intersex as a normal human variation. We do not think of this as a disorder or a pathology. And intersex people are doing a lot of work and advocacy to help people know that this is not a problem. It's just another way that people come. So let me show you a video. I am not intersex that I know of, so I'm going to let some intersex folks explain this a little bit better.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender nonconforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful, you're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
So y'all can see that that's a difficult thing, right? We still think of this as being a medical issue a lot of times. These folks are subjected to surgeries as infants, as you heard, sometimes for no reason than just to alter the appearance of the body and the genitals. Obviously, for me, I've seen this video so many times, and still I find it kind of painful to watch and to hear again and again what these folks go through. So I just want you to know it helps me to feel encouraged to know that intersex advocates are doing great work around this. They have gotten some very prominent medical groups to come out against these surgeries. They've actually gotten 3 former U.S. Surgeon Generals to publicly come out against these surgeries. There are countries in the world where these surgeries have been outlawed, especially when we're talking about infants. So this is something that is definitely moving forward. And I think, one of the things that might help intersex people is probably the main thing that trans people would like for folks to learn, because it's the thing that would help us the most. And that is if we could teach people that your gender, your internal gender, and your designated sex are 2 separate traits that you have, not one. And I think in our dominant culture, we really don't know that, right? We think if a baby is born and we say, oh, yay, it's a girl, then we just think that that baby is a girl and is going to be a girl, and we'll be happy to be a girl. But that's obviously not always true, right? That is totally what they said about me. When I was born, they said, it's a girl. And they were right. They were looking at my body and they did their jobs. They designated me female at birth, and that is totally okay. I'm not in denial about it. I understand why they said that. But my gender was always male. As soon as I could speak, I knew that I was a boy, and I actually started trying to tell people I was a boy. So even though my designated sex was female, my gender was male. If they don't match, they can't be one trait, right? One of the analogies I keep making around this, and I'm interested in, if people have reasons that this isn't a great analogy, I'm very interested to hear any pushback on it. But I keep thinking and talking about hair color and eye color, and the fact that we know those are separate, distinct attributes, even though if you go around the world, most human beings have brown hair and brown eyes. It is the most common thing for people to have brown hair and brown eyes. But we don't think that there's some need for them to be the same. We don't think that they're a single trait. We know that they are two separate traits. If people have non-matching values in those categories, we don't even care. We don't do anything about it, right? I have brown hair, but I have blue eyes. And nobody ever was like, well, let's do surgery on those eyeballs. They got to be brown, right? We don't even think of it that way. So we are urging people to think of sex and gender that same way that we think of hair color and eye color. For a majority of people, they match, and that's totally cool. But for some people, they don't. And that means they have to be thought of as separate. And speaking of prominent medical groups, there are several, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, that have written some position papers talking about the fact that kids know our gender between the ages of 3 and 5. And they were actually addressing trans kids, but the truth is that that's absolutely the case for cisgender people as well. Most people know what gender they are by the time that they are 5 years old. I think probably almost everyone in this room can look back and say that you were aware whether you were a boy or a girl before you were 5 years old. And if somebody is cisgender and they assert their gender, right? If a 4-year-old boy walks up to their parent and says, I'm a boy, and the parent's going to be like, yeah, whatever, duh, go play, right? But if a transgender boy who is 4 years old walks up to a parent and says, I'm a boy, usually the first thing we hear is something like, well, you're too young to know that, or you're too young to make that decision, as if the child is deciding to be a girl or a boy instead of just reporting what they know about themselves on the inside. I often say that if I could have chosen my gender, I would have chosen to be female. I was in my 30s when I started my transition, right? So when I was a kiddo, people allowed me to be what they called a tomboy. When I was 15, I came out for the first time as a lesbian, and I was welcomed and affirmed and validated by the lesbian community and the lesbian friends that I surrounded myself with. In fact, I had to give up, my membership in that group in order to go through my transition. And that was really painful. It was really difficult. Not that I still don't have a lot of lesbian friends, but it's not the same thing, right? I'm not a lesbian anymore because I'm a guy. So it's we relate in a different way. There was a big shift in the way that my life looked before and after transition when I think about my group membership, my community. So for me, if I could have been happy in the body that I was in, if I could have been fulfilled and actualized as a woman, I would have just been a woman. But from the time I was 2 or 3 years old, I knew that I was not a woman. And in my 30s, I finally decided that there was no room for me to continue on that way, and that I had to do something about it, or that I might hurt myself or even potentially try to kill myself. So I didn't choose my gender. I only got to choose what I was going to do about it. So with transgender kids, I think we do a lot better to respect them and listen to them, especially because with children, there's not like medical intervention or anything like that, right? We're just talking about letting them wear the clothes they want to wear, be addressed by the name they want to hear, etc. So your internal gender is a piece about you that is not visible. You cannot see somebody's gender. what you can see about a person is what we call gender expression, right? That's clothing, hairstyle, jewelry, makeup, speech, gait, gestures, mannerisms, all of the things that are culturally regarded as masculine or feminine. And I say culturally because it's fascinating to me, probably one of the most fascinating things in this topic, that gender norms and stereotypes are not universal. They change over time, even within a single cultural group, and they change from group to group, right? How interesting is that? So even in the United States, we can look at some really simple examples, like the fact that women in the US did not used to wear pants or jeans, right? That was even as late as the 70s. There were still some prohibitions around wearing pants for women. And now, of course, women just wear pants and jeans. We don't regard it as a subversive or courageous act. It's just that gender norm has changed. So the absolutely rigid gender norm of the 1950s was no pants for women. The gender norm of the 2020s is pants are fine for everybody, no big deal, right? The gender norm now on Zoom is, I guess, nobody wears pants at all. I don't know. We're moving into a whole new era around gender expression. We'll see what the Zoom era holds for all of us around gender norms. It's interesting to see a lot of people stopping wearing makeup and all kinds of stuff happening. So I really will be fascinated to see what happens with all of this. But gender norms change over time. Also from group to group, right? What exactly, Deborah? I don't want to know what people are wearing, okay? Don't tell me. So when I think about the fact that we call a piece of fabric that wraps around your waist a skirt, right? And we think of it as a female garment. But I can think of places like Scotland that refer to that same article of clothing as a kilt, and it's definitely thought of as a male piece of clothing. So a piece of fabric that wraps around your waist can't be male or female because it is your cultural group that is going to teach you how to code those things and how to engage with them. So gender expression, norms around masculinity and femininity are not universal. They're very much cultural, and it's your cultural upbringing that's going to teach you about those things. And there are never two kinds of people in this world. Non-binary people also exist, and they are valid and they are real. In fact, there are indigenous cultures throughout human history that have had words in their own indigenous languages for up to 5 or 6 different gender categories, not 2. So the idea that we only can fit into these 2 categories turns out to be kind of a more modern and Western concept. Other human cultures have recognized the fact that human beings are more complicated than any 2 categories can hold. So non-binary is not a new idea. It is not a youth culture idea. This is something that humans have known for a long time. It's not the norm in a dominant US culture, but it is definitely a real thing, a real phenomenon. And I want to show you some non-binary folks talking about this, because for me, I am, again, pretty binary, right? I'm not proud of it. I'm not saying it proudly. I'm just telling you that I fit into the gender binary pretty neatly. So I don't want to be the spokesperson for these folks. I want to let them speak for themselves.
I'm Fox, and this is what non-binary looks like.
I'm Owl, and this is what non-binary looks like. We don't necessarily expect you to know what that means, but let us explain.
I was assigned female at birth.
I was assigned male at birth. While many people understand what it is to be a trans man or a trans woman, being non-binary is still very misunderstood.
Being non-binary means that we identify as neither a man or a woman.
What makes us men or women or non-binary is an inner sense of self.
It's not what genitals we have, what we wear, or who we're attracted to.
It's who we are, which is something no one can take away from us.
Gender identity and gender expression are 2 different things.
The fact that I present as feminine,
the fact that I present as masculine,
does not make us any less non-binary.
It's just clothes, it's just presentation, it's just a form of expression.
Non-binary people have always existed, and they do so in cultures all around the world.
Non-binary people do not want to erase your identity as a man or a woman.
All non-binary people want is to be respected and acknowledged for who they are.
Non-binary people are real, authentic, and express themselves in so many different ways. We are legally recognized in countries such as Malta, New Zealand, Australia, Nepal, and more.
We encourage all non-binary people to share their selfies under the hashtag #ThisIsWhatNonBinary looks like.
The hashtag is already well and truly underway, and it's a real inspiration for us all.
I'm Al, and this is what non-binary looks like.
I'm Fox, and this is what non-binary looks like.
Okay, so your gender expression, and your designated sex are three separate things about you. And the fourth and final thing is your orientation, right? And this is another thing that's been sort of conflated. And I think partially because we say LGBT. And I think for folks who don't understand what those things mean, it makes it all seem like it's one thing. You know, in the 10 years I've been doing this, I've often had somebody posit the opposite of trans as straight to me, right? But a trans person can be straight, and a trans person can be gay, and a trans person can be bisexual, pansexual, any of these things. If you know that somebody's trans, you do not know which one of these they are. If we know that somebody is a cisgender woman, we do not know which one of these she is, right? Somebody's gender and their designated sex do not dictate who they're attracted to. A cisgender woman could be any of the things on the screen, and a transgender woman could also be any of these things on this screen. Trans people are in every single category that cisgender people are in. So it's important to make sure we think of these as separate. Now, this is just sort of a visual on what we've been talking about. If you find this helpful, that's great. And if you don't, then just disregard it. Let me just go through my dots super quickly. It looks like we're gonna have time for questions, which is always so great. So let me show you where I fall on these things, right? So my designated sex at birth was female. See how female's over here? Male is on the right. Both is at the top, and neither is at the bottom. So for me, mine tend to fall sort of on this x-axis, right? Other people may find themselves way up here, but I don't. So my designated sex at birth was female, straight up. I'm on the left side. My internal gender is male. So I stay right on that same line, but I travel over to the right side. My gender expression is pretty stereotypically masculine, so I fall right here. Now these don't touch at all. They're totally separate. My sexual orientation is towards people who appear female. I don't know why that is true about me, but I'm almost 50. I can reliably report to you that my attraction mechanism does not kick into gear unless somebody appears female. So I fall on this side of the circle. I don't think of it as a dot. Now I'm just gonna give you 10 seconds to silently think about where your own dots go today, because in your lifetime, they may shift. In my lifetime, these dots shifted. The only ways that I knew how to talk about and think about myself 20 years ago did not fall in the same place I just showed you. So it's okay if yours change, and it's okay if they don't change. But I know you all know where you go today. So just look up here and think about that. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you is the data, even though it's a major bummer. This is from the New Mexico Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey. So this is a survey that is done with our public high school students. Not every school in the state participates, but a lot of them do. So these are young people who are in high school who confidentially take this survey on paper. Every state has a similar survey, and every state gets to decide what questions go on their survey. In 2017, for the first time, we asked our students, do you consider yourself transgender, gender fluid, or gender queer? Because we wanted non-binary people included in the definition of trans. 3.4% of the high school students surveyed just said, I do definitely think of myself that way. And they were in every single county of our state. And we have some very rural areas in New Mexico. Another almost 3%, 2.9% more, said, I am struggling with this right now, but I am not ready to use those labels. I'm unsure about how to classify myself. They did not mean I don't understand the question, because that was a response. You could just say, I don't understand the question. So these kids were not saying that. We can also see it because their outcomes were comparable to the trans kids, which were very far away from the cis kids. So the trans and the unsure groups both had incredibly disparate negative outcomes from the cisgender group, right? Now these bullets only compare the 3.4 to the cis. We just didn't want to muddy the waters with the unsure group, but look at the disparities. 4 times the suicide attempt in a 12-month period. Look how almost a third of these kids had actively tried to kill themselves within the last 12 months. Look at the bottom, look at sexual violence. And then look at heroin use, right? This is about coping mechanisms. You know, I allow that these are maladaptive coping mechanisms, but this is just young people trying to deal with the pain that they are already experiencing from discrimination and violence, even young, at 18 years old or younger. So that's what the heroin stat says to me. And these are our children in New Mexico, and this is what we're allowing to happen, right? So this is what gets me out of bed every day. The New Mexico data hits me harder than anything else. But the national data is very much the same. And the national data really shores up the intersectional nature of this. We can see it right on this slide. This is the biggest data set we have on trans people today. 28,000 of us took this survey. And the suicide attempt rate on this survey was also just completely out of control. Now we know that the suicide attempt numbers don't show like mental illness for trans people, or that being trans is a mental illness. We see the suicide numbers come down when people's families love them, when they are able to access quality medical care, and also, interestingly, if they live in states that have legal protections for trans people, which New Mexico is one of about 15 states that has that. So we have a few minutes, we have about 7 minutes for questions or comments, which I'd love to hear anything you want to say. You don't have to have a question. If there's something you want to share, please say it. If there's something you want to ask, now is the opportunity. If you don't mind, I'd really also love it if you would take my little eval. It's super short, really easy. If you point your phone at this QR code, it'll take you to the mobile version of it. And I'm going to post the URL into the chat window. If you would prefer to do it on your browser, then of course, please do that. I'm going to put it in right now. If you click on that, it'll take you to a web browser window with the same exact, very simple evaluation of this training. So do it on your phone by holding your camera up to the screen, or click on the link in the chat window. The chat window. Exactly, you're right, Birgit. I sent it to somebody one-on-one. Here's everybody, okay? There we go. So totally just use the link or use the QR code. Now, what do y'all want to say? What do you want to chime in with?
Mind if I ask a question, just for some context for this group?
Great.
Adrien, as National Student Exchange Coordinators, we're sending and receiving students from our campuses to other campuses all across the country. I could assume, or I could perhaps see that a student might be more comfortable going to a campus. Let's say they're at a campus that is not as accommodating or accepting of trans folks, and they know that the University of New Mexico is a great place for people of trans identities, right? What are some things that I or we as a coordinator for a campus could do that would essentially ensure that students who may be trans but are not easily identified can feel supported when they start on campus?
I mean, I think there are so many policies and even sort of logistical and architectural things that people can help to advocate for, right? Like one of the big things at UNM that people had to fight for was the ability to use chosen name on things like your student ID or your diploma, right? That these don't have to be legal name. And it's often this sort of longstanding policy or belief that you have to use your legal name in these settings, but you really don't. And to advocate for people to be able to use the name that they use for themselves in every setting on a university campus is a huge thing. to make sure that there are single occupancy, gender neutral bathrooms. You know, I never as a young person thought that so much of my adult professional life would be taken up with talking about where people get to pee and poo. I just didn't imagine this would be my career, you know, is talking about where folks get to use the bathroom all the time. But it's a huge thing for trans people, right? We're scared to go to the bathroom. So making sure that there are gender neutral single occupancy bathrooms or multiple, right? College campuses are actually a place where we're seeing some experimentation with bathrooms that have 3 or 4 stalls but are just labeled as a bathroom. And I think that's a great sort of incubation place to try these things. You know, we see dorms where young people are showering in the same, you know, the bathroom for the whole hall. Men and women, young men and women are all living in that dorm, and they're all using the same bathroom with showers and things together. So we, you know, universities are a place where we can show that this can be done, so that culturally we can expand that awareness and universal bathrooms around the country. So I think making sure that bathroom policy is meaningfully inclusive of trans people. University of Hawaii, we're just seeing right now in the chat, just recently implemented gender neutral bathrooms on campus. So that's huge. I think for trans and non-binary folks, when we see that, what we see is there's an effort to include us and to make things inclusive for us. Make sure that they're identified well. Make sure that there's even maybe a map of the neutral bathrooms on campus. Because if there's only one and it's way out on one side of the campus, it's kind of not good enough, right? If I have all my classes in a building on the east side of the campus and the only gender neutral bathroom is on the west side of the campus, then I still have got a problem, because I can't every single time have to go all the way over there to use the bathroom I'm most comfortable in. So mapping them, making sure there's enough of them, that's a big deal, you know? I would say making sure that there are like queer student associations being maybe willing to be a sponsor for that type of thing. I mean, those are really good, you know? So NSE HQ does a great job of allowing students to identify how they wish. Some universities don't allow it. That's another incredible thing, right? With applications, other ways that people are sort of filing themselves in with the institution. We want to make sure that we have the opportunity to self-identify gender, to identify your chosen name, sometimes called your preferred name. We're just moving away from the word preferred, right? Your chosen name, your pronouns, your gender, all of those things should be self-identification. And we really want to make sure that on forms we have a way to do that. Is there a list of traits of U.S. campuses that are considered trans inclusive? You know, I'm sure that there are. So let me find that when we hang up, and I'll send it to Greg, okay? I will send that sort of like how to make your college or university campus more inclusive for trans folks. I will send that to Greg, who can then send it out to y'all. Medical resources and mental health resources, Anya just said, and that is huge. One of the great things that we've seen at UNM is that SHAC has really become a place where people can access transition-related care. So that's been an enormous shift in the last few years that has absolutely been lauded by trans students and by the community at large too. Let me go back up. I'm also looking for this info. I have many trans students who are eager to study away but nervous about traveling, being supported and accepted, and absolutely that's true. There are lists not only of traits that make for a good campus, there are some lists I think about campuses that we already know are inclusive. So those are resources I will send to Greg to distribute. Brigitte says, my daughter's in high school. I'm amazed at how open her friends are compared to when I was in high school in the early 80s. And I totally agree. You know, that's something I have to hold a real both and position on, is that I look at that New Mexico Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey data, and my heart breaks for how hard it still is to be a trans young person, and looking at those negative and even violent outcomes. I mean, that sexual violence data just like, I don't know, it makes me want to just like get under the covers and never come back out, right? Why is it that 7% of our students in New Mexico who are cisgender can report that they've been forced to have sexual intercourse against their will? I mean, 7% is an enormous number, but for the trans students, it was 21%, right? So trans young people are still struggling and suffering, and Brigitte, I completely agree. I find that it is absolutely generational, that many more young people understand this. They already know the terminology. They have LGBTQ friends, trans and non-binary friends. They have no trouble at all using the singular they pronoun. They don't even think about it, right? So you're absolutely right, and I think that's encouraging. I find it heartening to think that those are the young people that are going to help us continue to shift the culture forward on this issue. So I love that too. I absolutely think that too. What else are y'all thinking about? I can see that a lot of your thoughts are running towards your professional stuff. And I know we're probably out of time too, but if there's any last thing you want to say or chime in with or ask. Yeah, again, I don't think so the question that just popped up is, are there stats about how many trans kids are going to college? What we have are statistics that say that they are less likely to, right? One of the great surveys that we have is from GLSEN, which stands for the Gay and Lesbian and Straight Educators Network. And they mean trans. You know, some of these old organizations have acronyms and names that don't have trans in the name, but they've evolved to really include trans content. So GLSEN has a K through 12 school climate survey that's national. And what it showed is that K through 12 trans students are having terrible outcomes. And when they do, their grade point is affected, you know, duh, but we have the data from this. And that they are much less likely to think of pursuing any kind of college education after they graduate, if they graduate. So we know that the numbers are still not what they should be. And right now we're not tracking trans students enrolled in college effectively, so we can't have an estimate. You know, there are schools where you just still can't identify yourself as trans on any demographic forms or applications. So we don't know how many are in there. We know that there are fewer going to college, pursuing college, than among cis. Thank you, Sonia. We'll definitely get that out there. I will definitely get that to you. Yeah, so somebody is saying that in terms of gender pronouns, they're seeing this in signature lines, and I absolutely do encourage that. If we were using my Zoom, you would see that my name on Zoom is Adrien Lawyer with he, him, right after my name. I added that to my name identification on Zoom so that my pronouns are always legible and always visible to people that I'm on Zoom with. And in my email signature, they're there too. Every person who works for Planned Parenthood in the United States now has their gender pronouns in their signature line. Huge numbers of colleagues of mine at UNM and New Mexico State, other universities here in New Mexico have added their pronouns. Now, what I wouldn't do is use the word preferred. So let me look at my, and that is, again, just something that we have started to do more and more, is pull back from the word preferred. Because there is, and no offense, right? It's not at all a problem. But what we see is that preferred has a little whiff of like it's almost like, and it's not meant to be. So I'm not, please, anybody who used the word preferred, no, I'm not coming at you directly. But what we have come to feel is that the word preferred has a little whiff of like condescension to it, right? Like you prefer, you identify as male, so I will respect the way you identify. When really my gender is male, just like your gender is whatever it is. My gender pronouns are he, him, his. Your gender pronouns are whatever they are, right? If we say preferred pronouns for trans folks, we tend not to say preferred pronouns for cis folks. So in my signature line, it says Adrien Lawyer, co-director, Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. The next line is pronouns, he, him, his. The next line is my website. The next line is my phone number, right? So you can just list your pronouns in your signature line or gender pronouns. And I would absolutely say to do it, because when you say your pronouns, what you are saying is, I know that people can't guess my pronouns. If you are cisgender, you are probably accustomed to people correctly assuming your pronouns. But what we are trying to do is say we cannot assume each other's gender. Even if yours is visible to other people, how do they know that, right? There are people who look exactly like me, but who identify as non-binary. So how would I know that? Just by looking at them. If I looked at someone who looked like me, I would think, oh, that's a he. They want to be called he, but they really might not. They may use they. And we don't know each other. We don't know who's in the closet. We don't know who's struggling. We don't know who's completed a transition. We don't know who's just embarking on one. So saying your pronouns normalizes the fact that everyone has to say their pronouns. Because even though you know that you are cis, I don't, right? So it's acknowledging that people outside of you don't know your gender just by looking at you. So listing your pronouns creates a real safe space for trans and non-binary people, because they look at your signature and say, wow, you are aware of the fact that pronouns have to be part of the discussion. Pronouns have to be part of introductions, right? And when you identify yourself as someone who knows that, then it makes me feel like I can talk to you about trans things and that I won't have to go all the way back to the beginning and educate you before we can have that conversation. You know, Deborah, I would say if I don't see pronouns in people's signatures, I don't necessarily think something bad about that person. I often just think, well, maybe they have not been taught that, or they just don't know. You know, so I think that it's okay not to know, but if you do know this, then it's really effective in establishing yourself as a trusted ally, someone I can come to for help if I see those pronouns in there. It makes me think that you have some fluency around trans issues and trans people. So it's a good indicator that you have undergone some kind of training, or that you have a trans loved one, or that you care about creating safety and access for trans people. So it's not, you know, it's not a knock if you don't do it, but if you do it, it's huge. I know, Birgit, it seems like a small thing, right? But it's an incredibly big first step for a lot of people, and it's something for us that it signals a lot to trans folks. Thank you, Daniela, for asking that. I do. My Zoom name typically looks like this. I'm going to change it right now. My Zoom looks like this most of the time. We're not on my Zoom account. We're on Greg's or David's NSE's or something. But on my Zoom, when I initiate the Zoom meeting, that's how my name shows up under my picture. It's just like that. And you can change it in your Zoom preferences. And again, that's a cool place to do it. Right? If everybody had their pronouns on their Zoom name, then we would know how to talk about each other. Like, I have had to studiously avoid using pronouns for Birgit and Anya and the other people who've been chatting with me, because I don't know y'all. So I see the name Birgit and I think, well, that's probably she, but I'm not going to say it out loud because I don't know Birgit. So if Birgit has their picture up on Zoom with their pronouns, then I can see it. And I would say, oh, Birgit does go by she. I'm going to talk about her as a she, right? So it's cool. Wherever you can identify your pronouns, if you do it, it means a lot to people, and it shows that there's a safe space for us to talk about that. Edgardo, I will definitely send the video link along with those other resources to Greg, so it's all in one email to be forwarded out. And Greg, if you will just forward my email has my cell phone number, my pronouns, and my email address on it. So you can contact me anytime after today. If there's anything that you want to talk to me about after today's presentation, Greg will send out my email to all of y'all, which in my signature has all of my contact info. So please don't hold back for any reason. If you want to text me, call me, or email me, you are welcome and invited to do so. I would love to talk to any of you at any time. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon, for being present. I know we're all really strung out and hurting and going through a lot and doing a lot of Zoom meetings, I know. So I can't tell you what it means to me as a presenter to have you stick it out for an hour and a half, to be so present, to be so interactive. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for that.